Hello, my name is Brittany Johnson. I'm from the Douglas County Historical Society. Today I am joined by my friend, colleague, peer,
person. I'm Kaci Johnson from the Legacy of the Lakes Museum.
Could you tell me like a quick 30-second summary of what you guys do?
Here at the Legacy of the Lakes Museum, we like to focus on the legacy that is our lakes, like the name says. So we talk about like culture and memory and ephemera from lake life. So everything from resort history to classic and vintage wooden watercraft to water fun, jet skis, water skis, surfboards, anything you can do to have fun on the lake, we have.
That's really cool, and why I've asked you to join me today while we talk about stories from Lake Darling. Little bits of history, some fun little tidbits. Lake Darling here in Douglas County is, of course, one of the chain of lakes that we have in the middle-ish of Douglas County, next to Alexandria. I'm looking at some Minnesota DNR statistics here. Lake Darling has a maximum depth of 62 feet, average water clarity 13.4 feet, shore length 6.8 miles. Area is a little over 1,000 acres. I trust the DNR for those statistics. I did not go out and measure them myself.
Oh, I was kind of having fun picturing you out in the weeds, like trying to
With a tape measure.
or like a surveyor's chain.
But like I said, sorry, we're talking about Lake Darling.
Why?
And well, it's one of these lakes that has a lot of interesting stories tied to it.
I think so.
Everything from the name to the resorts, the people who have lived there. One of the first things, of course, to talk about with any of our lakes in Douglas County, but I will say in particular lakes on our chain. The lakes, true, the names they carry today came from European and white settlers, immigrants who came this direction, but they were the homes to people before us.
Oh, yeah.
Starting from probably around at least the woodland period. We do have archaeological evidence in Douglas County that there were woodland and late woodland period peoples here in Douglas County, or on this land that would later become Douglas County. Some indication that they were associated with the Sinomani culture, so potentially ancestors, precursors to today's Santee, Dakota.
Yes.
These people did build mounds on the shores of the lakes. We have newspaper accounts that also talk about a lot of these mounds, a lot of these graves being opened by the early immigrants to this area, and also being like cut down and excavated, dug out, and moved to make more room for cabins and
The booming population.
Yeah, resorts, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them have survived to the modern day, but of course locations are not made publicly available. Just wanted to touch on that because Douglas County saw a lot of its growth after the U.S.-Dakota War, so we lost a lot of our history and any written records that came before kind of that 1865 period. But it was here. We had groups of Dakota, we had groups of Ojibwe who lived in this area, again, died in this area, buried their dead here, this was their home.
I think there's this idea that because we have like 95% white in our area, that the history is all European based. So it's great that you touched on the Native Americans who were here before, because just because we don't see it now doesn't mean that it didn't exist.
Right, and we're dealing with a very systematic way where written records were, one, not written, not recorded, or removed.
Yeah.
Outright removed, so we don't have those today. And the physical things, again, like mounds, like village sites that were left behind, were plundered.
Yes.
Plundered or cut down, pushed in a lake so that there was more room to have picnics. The Lake Darling name today comes from Andreas Darling.
Who's Andreas Darling, Brittany?
I'm so glad you asked. So, again, we're talking about this very early period when Douglas County really got, let's say, going in terms of population was after the Civil War. But there were still a few people who were here before then. People doing homesteads, people getting in on the town site of Alexandria, which was located where the stagecoach line had been cut to Fort Abercrombie. One of these early figures is Andreas M. Darling. in the area basically from 1859. Family and relatives are in the area in 1864. But he was a prominent figure. He was a very capable farmer. People went to him for advice, as all of the stories go. He was also very tall. He was over 6 feet tall, and he almost reads like something out of a old Western novel. That he had to have a gun custom manufactured for him named Biting Betty, because he was such a tall man and such a large man that he needed a larger firearm. He farmed on the shores of Lake Darling. He, apparently sometimes got into altercations with bears.
I mean, as you do when you live in what was then not very settled area by Europeans.
Exactly. And there's a lot more instances of black bears in this area in those days. A lot of different wildlife than what we see today. And on one occasion, he even took a bear cub from the mother and trained it to do tricks. And it was eventually sold, as the story goes. This is a little hard to verify, but as the story goes, that bear cub was sold on to a Mississippi riverboat steamer where it became an entertainment bear.
I kind of hope that's not true.
That is as the story goes. But again, we mentioned the U.S.-Dakota War earlier, and when that event was happening, a lot of the people who had started homesteading this area just prior to moved to St. Cloud. They fled the area. Mr. Darling was one of them. And then we had this Civil War happening. So it was very difficult in some aspects to figure out where you were going to move, where you were going to go in life. It wasn't, people didn't feel comfortable enough coming back to rural Minnesota like Douglas County, but you couldn't necessarily move south because there was a lot of conflict there.
You don't say.
Darling and a friend and business partner, Myron Colony. Myron came into possession of a farm near Rolla, Missouri. And it's a little bit unclear if it was a seizure, if it was a legitimate tax forfeiture, if there were politics involved. That's a little bit, again, unclear, and that's what's going to lead to some of the conflict down the line. Myron needed somebody able-bodied, somebody who knew how to run a farm to help him take care of this farm and make sure it was profitable. So he enlisted the help of his friend, Mr. Andreas Darling. What do you think happens next?
Either they have a falling out or not something else not so great.
Well, you're pretty close with the something else not so great. So the farm had previously been owned by a Lennox family, and their perception was that the farm had been unjustly taken. Again, now documentation over how the farm came to be in Colony's hands, a couple different sides of the story. But they felt that the Union had kind of unfairly forced their family off of that farm. So they arrived in the middle of the night one night as a group of bushwhackers, a group that was sympathetic to the Confederate Army, but was not necessarily formally within the Confederate Army. And they said that the only people who were going to be living on that farm were going to be them. During this event, during the night, Mr. Darling was shot and killed.
Oh.
And it's a very dramatic story.
Oh, that's sad.
It is. His daughter was there, begged to give him a drink of water, which the bushwhackers would not allow, as the story goes. His wife was there. Militarily, you can find correspondence between officers about this event. The farm did provide hay for the Union Army, things of that nature. Mr. Darling was given a military funeral under officer orders, but we, as far as I know, at the Historical Society, but also family members who have looked, have never been able to find where his grave is. Body never made it back to Douglas County. Not for lack of trying. So Myron Colony did write a book called Man O' Min that was supposed to raise funds to bring his body back to Douglas County, or technically to Todd County, because a lot of Darling's relatives, his wife, they're actually buried in Long Prairie.
Okay.
But nothing appears to have ever come of that.
Oh.
And we don't know where he was buried. But his name certainly lives on in Lake Darling, on locations surrounding it.
So maybe, so was Darling, was it called that when he was living on there? Like, that's Darling's Lake? Or did they name it, like, posthumously as, like, this was a guy, let's name it after him?
I believe it was the former.
Okay.
Because they were some of the first immigrants to the area.
And that's a pretty common practice, too, was to name, like, oh, that's Sven's Lake. We don't have a Sven's Lake, but...
We have many lakes named under that convention.
Yeah.
Bergen's Lake. Basically all of the lakes that are near major population centers in Douglas County were named for early immigrants to the area.
Mm-hmm.
But so that's where we get the name. His family did return after the Civil War.
Oh, they did. Okay. That was going to be my next question, so thank you.
So moving on to another sort of segment of Lake Darling here, as you kind of alluded to with your description of what the Legacy of the Lakes Museum does, there's a lot of resort history in this area. Would you say that is accurate?
That's extremely accurate. So, obviously our area is blessed with many lakes, and lakes provide something called a cooling effect. So if you could afford to, back in the day, you wanted to get out of those crowded cities and go somewhere cool, and so when the railroad comes through, it's very easy to just hop on a train if you could afford it and come on up here, and in that vein, tons of resorts appeared to cater to these people who were coming to the lakes to cool off in the summer.
Dozens. I think at the peak, wasn't there like at least 100 resorts in Douglas County?
If not more. I mean, there were also people who just, were like, oh yeah, you can stay in my cabin. And
people who stayed in hotels, and so, it was very, very large part, especially for early Alexandria's industry.
Yes.
And early Douglas County's industry.
Mm-hmm.
It's very evident even early on. When we are talking about when the first train arrives in Alexandria, so around 1878, because it had gotten held up for 6 years in Melrose due to financial difficulties, we see, again, almost immediately newspapers kind of extolling the virtues of come up here, fish the lakes. Mm-hmm. I brought a broadsheet with me talking about the Lady of the Lakes and the gem of the park region, Alexandria. Which, Lady of the Lakes, funnily enough, you'll also see that as a boat name, am I correct?
It is. It's like the banner name of Alexandria Boatworks. So, Alexandria Boatworks was founded in the 1880s here in Alexandria by Eric Boat Erickson. He was an immigrant, and he came here and ostensibly built his first boat at a very young age, but formally incorporated his company in 1886. And so he provided boats for the fishermen, people who are coming out to go fishing. And the industry grew, and it was around for over 100 years, or nearly 100 years, so.
I know when I look at a lot of antique photos, we're seeing those Lady of the Lake boats in resort pictures. Mm-hmm. People really, again, extolled just how amazing the lakes were, also how easy it was to catch fish. Mm-hmm. I've seen articles from when they were first kind of toying with the idea of imposing limits on how many fish you can take in a day. And people before that, were bringing home almost absurdly large amounts of fish.
Yes, they were. Like, I love some of those old photos you see. I think it's one of our postcards that you and we did collabed on. It's just like this long line of fish. And what I like about fishing in the earlier areas, too, is that it wasn't just for men who were going out fishing. Like, everybody came to go fishing. So women and children. It was such a big thing.
It's so funny you gave me that transition without even knowing what I had next.
Oh.
Because one of the things on this 1903 broadside about the area, and I think perhaps for the time this was a little bit more progressive, but for you and I today it's not going to read that way. Of all places for a summer outing, the gentle sex will find conditions at Alexandria suited to their requirements, for not only are the majority of the ladies resident of the village fairly expert with the rod and reel, and in some instance quite expert, but ladies who have journeyed here for the first time and have never fished before have, before the season ended, demonstrated their plactorial dexterity. I know, that's a great phrase.
Wow.
Plactorial dexterity. Often to the wonder and admiration of their more experienced male companions, who may incline to the opinion of a long usage that women cannot become deft anglers. A catch of gray bass one afternoon last season by two lady visitors, illustrated in this article, will surely displace any sentiment that they are not entitled to rank with the best anglers. And I mean, we have to read that as an advertisement saying, like, hey, ladies, even if you're not a fan of fishing, don't worry. Even if you've never fished before, it's really easy to fish in this area. Women can fish too. Don't worry about it. Please come here. But on the other hand, it is interesting that it is actually a selling point.
Yes, it is, very much so.
And one of the last pieces I really liked about this broadsheet telling us about, you know, why we should all come to Alexandria in 1903 and vacation on the lakes was just kind of coming at the end. The mention of a lot of like the nature and kind of hunting opportunities, but also just wildlife that we don't have anymore. One of them being jackrabbits, and they mentioned jackrabbit hunting. And now I've heard from like my grandparents, they remember seeing some of the jackrabbits throughout different seasons in this area. I know we're still listed as like possible jackrabbit habitat, but I personally have never seen a jackrabbit in Douglas County.
I don't think I've ever seen a jackrabbit in my life.
No, well, and I think you've even been in places where some of that, again, like the habitat is supposedly more jackrabbit friendly. Part of that might be because, you know, I think they're more nocturnal. But
I just don't get outside much.
No, I'm sure it's nocturnal. Don't worry about
That's
it.
totally the reason.
And they talk about like prairie chickens and grouse and, again, just like these animals that I'm not familiar with as a Douglas County phenomenon anymore. Have you ever noticed that in terms of fish or things mentioned on the lakes?
You know, we still are a pretty good destination for fishing, but I think people are becoming a lot more conscious about the health of the water because they're more conscious about those fishing levels now. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
So they want, you know, to take care of the water so that they keep those healthy populations.
Which is, yeah, obviously important. And good that we're aware of it now. So that, you know, it's not like the jackrabbit where it, again, has become like this mythical creature almost.
I honestly wasn't even sure if it was real.
No, jackrabbits are real. They are technically hares, I think, because their young are born furred and can open their eyes and can move around a few hours after birth.
Oh, interesting.
I think that's the difference between a hare and a rabbit. The more you know. But moving forward a little bit in time here, this is one of my favorite funny stories we can say from Lake Darling, and it comes to us from the Park Region Echo of July 22nd, 1937. Channel dug in Lake Darling Bar. Cottage owners dig channel into Lake Little Darling under cover of darkness Saturday. Lakeshore cottagers on Little Darling cut a channel last Saturday night through the bar between that lake and Big Darling, and a flow of water through the channel obtained that should raise the water level in Little Darling. Now, I'm sure you're going to catch on to this article talking about a Big Darling and a Little Darling, not just a Lake Darling. 1937 is a big drought year. Water levels are down. Little Darling kind of being a sort of bay, an offshoot of Lake Darling, which they explain in the next paragraph. Up to a few years ago, Little Darling was a bay in the big lake, but during the drought years, a bar which was underwater became dry land, 150 yards wide and extending the full width of the lake. This cut off the bay into a separate lake, and having only a small drainage into it, Little Darling was not raised by the heavy rainfall this year, which raised all of the other lakes in the county. A collection was taken up among the property owners living on Little Darling last week, and men and teams hired to open a channel. Lakeshore property owners on the main lake protested against opening such a channel because it would lower the level of the main lake, Big Darling. So the folks on Little Darling slipped one over on the big lake dwellers and did the dredging under cover of darkness Saturday night, digging a trench across the bar and getting a good flow of water into their lower lake. An appeal to County Attorney Kenneth Dell was made by property owners on Big Darling, who claimed that it is illegal to lower the level of a lake in that manner. But the county attorney found on consulting the records that the government's surveys of meandered lakes show Lake Darling is only one lake, with Little Darling as a bay, not a separate lake, so it seems that the property owners on Big Darling have no legal power to prevent such a channel from being opened. So, to sum that story down, you've got people who are like, hey, we're on the same lake. We should share water. Please, we're on the little bay. The drought's been rough. And other people on the other side are like, no, It's our water. We need that to, launch boats and do things.
We need that water.
Yeah, so don't you dare hire people to dig a trench. And so what do?
They just did it themselves.
They just did it themselves, like under the cover of darkness. I
appreciate that enterprising spirit.
I assume they still probably hired somebody to help, you would think, but to be like, we have to do this under the cover of darkness, dig a trench, and then to try to sue about it, right? To try to sue and be like, they're stealing our lake, and the county attorney in the position to be like, but it's all the same lake. Like, I just want to imagine what that was like being out there on the sandbar in the middle of that night. And I also wonder if it had any, like, significant impact. I didn't really find much follow-up to this, so I don't know what happened much afterwards.
Well, it reconnected Darling to everybody else.
And we've certainly had more rain since then.
Yes.
Awesome. So, this next story is just a little one, and when I gave you our outline for this today, I put this in as a little surprise.
Oh.
Have you ever heard of cottages that were given away on Lake Darling as part of contests?
I have not.
Did you know that one such cottage was given away by the Crystal Sugar Company?
Huh.
Yeah. So we're looking at 1957. Crystal Sugar, like the brand you can recognize at the store today. It's got that
well, their home offices
ring.
are in Minnesota, aren't they?
Yeah, which makes sense why they picked a cabin on Lake Darling. So they had this contest starting, I think, in May. They were advertising it. If you sent in a name for this new lake home that they had built, you maybe would win it. And I found out later that people who grew up in this area, I don't know what the winning name was, but locals would point it out and be like, that's the Crystal Sugar Cottage. Like, it was one of the names, and I've heard stories similar to that on other lakes, people who would point at cottages and say, the man who has that cottage invented handles for mattresses. I don't know
Genius,
how true
by the way.
that is, but, like, it is just amusing to me that, that's the Crystal Sugar Cottage. That's the mattress handle cottage. So the Crystal Sugar Cottage was won by a couple from Iowa City who chose to actually sell it. They didn't keep it for themselves. They sold it. Robert L Burmeister, the wife of the couple, was Dolores Burmeister. They decided to sell it because he wanted the money to go on to college.
Smart.
Unfortunately, he was kind of tragically fell ill and died a few short years later.
Sad.
So he didn't really get to take advantage of that, but I thought it was worth noting this Crystal Sugar Cottage, this beautiful, right here on Lake Darling, to be able to look at something like that and just...
I wonder if it actually looks like this picture you have here, because next boat show I might go out and try and find it from
You should. You should.
See which one it is.
See if maybe it's in like the Crystal Sugar colors.
Maybe. Red and pink and white, or blue and pink and white?
Probably not, but what a dream.
That's pretty interesting. I didn't know that existed. I'm intrigued enough now to like...
It is those
try
little
and
bits of
find
just
it.
being like, oh, okay.
I bet just somebody on my board knows.
Probably.
I'll find out.
You should ask.
Okay.
That's what happened to me. But to kind of round us off today, let's talk about the Darling Dude Ranch in Arrowwood. And now you put together some exhibits and kind of materials for that for you.
Yeah, it's one of our traveling exhibits we bring around.
Did you debut that at the boat show last year?
We did debut it at the boat show, and fittingly enough, our boat show is held at Arrowwood every year the second Saturday in July, so it seemed fitting to do its history.
It is. It is. So what can you tell me about the Darling Dude Ranch in Arrowwood?
Well, the property that it sits on was originally a 75-acre farm, and it was purchased by two brothers, George and Paul Anderson, in 1946 for about $1,000. So if you think about today's money, I do believe it is, let's see here, it's about almost $14,000 today. So 75 acres for $14,000 is a very good deal. So bought it for about $1,000, and they were teachers. So George was the new principal at the Alexandria Junior High.
Okay.
And they were looking for something to occupy their summers, because Alexandria, of course, like we've talked about before, is a resort town.
Well, and the population swells, it more than doubles in the summer, right? It goes from like, I want to say like, if winter counts for population around 13,000 within the city limits of Alexandria, it's easily over 50 in the summer, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So initially, one of the brothers, Paul, he just wanted to have a resort. But the other brother, George, he was very interested in the dude ranches he had heard about out west.
Okay, so can you just define a dude ranch for me?
So dude ranches appeared in kind of the 19th century. Some people think it originated in the Dakotas, but basically out west, and upper class or, business class folk could go to these dude ranches and kind of experience the cowboy life. Remember, particularly like starting in like the late 19th century, early 20th century, the West is heavily romanticized.
Yes.
So participating in these dude ranches was a way for these people who wouldn't usually.
Well, and wasn't there pushback with like Theodore Roosevelt in some ways? People said putting on the airs of a Western persona and how much he actually participated in.
Yes, it was. So actually, Theodore Roosevelt, one of the first ranches was near Medora. And of course today, Teddy Roosevelt National Park and all of that. And so he would invite his friends out from out east, and they were called dudes. And that's the dude ranch. So,
interesting.
Yeah, but there was definitely some pushback for, they weren't really cowboys. They were kind of living like cowboy light.
I can see that.
So one of the brothers, George, was heavily interested in this idea of the dude ranch. But they found that it turned people off because people expected it to be really fancy and also expensive.
Okay.
So it turned off their target customer, which was families.
Okay.
Yeah, so, it started after World War II, really big tourism boom with the cars and everything, so they wanted to attract all these families, and this was not it. So it was called the Darling Dude Ranch for a few years before they just decided to just
drop
the name altogether. So it goes from the Darling Dude Ranch to the Darling Ranch Resort.
And did that kind of bring a uptick in guests?
It did. So at first, obviously first they had to convert it from farmland to usable land, and there was a lot of swamp area. It's between two lakes.
I can imagine lots of marshes, lots of mosquitoes.
Yeah, so they brought in land to make it filled in land to make it more usable, and then they used the farmhouse as living quarters for them and their families, and then it was also the dining hall, and then basically they built the first cabins out of anything they could find, because of World War II there was that lumber shortage, so they used an old chicken coop, an old granary, and reconstructed them into the original initial cabins.
And there were still horses?
Not quite originally. So horses were probably definitely the number one attraction of.
So I've heard a lot about the horses because one of my board members, volunteers, lived in the area. While during the summer, the horses were for guests and for people staying, to use. During the winter, kind of the local kids got to take care of a horse, ride a horse, have a horse at home.
Yeah, so it was something that people definitely came for. So George Anderson, I'm going to read a quote from him. He says, "Most people come here because they feel it's a good, safe place for their children. They know kids won't be hanging around the cabins wondering what to do or asking to go back home. With satisfied children, parents don't mind lying around in the cabin and taking it easy when it is too wet to go fishing." And so he recalled that every morning there'd just be kids lined up on the fence waiting to go on horseback riding.
Aww.
And the brothers invested in a Navy raft, an old Navy raft from a surplus store.
Okay.
And put it out in the water for the kids to play on. And they had playground equipment and everything. And then for the adults, their wives, Marion, and I believe her name was Margaret, they served home-cooked Swedish meals to the guests who were staying.
Cool.
So it was very... a place for families, really. So, they kind of focused on the family more, family fun, and they had something else that was really fun there, too. They had a water ski show.
Well, okay. So, sorry, my brain just did like a hard left turn from dude ranches and Western aesthetic to, all right, grab your water skis, let's go.
See, we're not really the area for a dude ranch.
But
we
water
are
skis.
the area for water skis. So many of you might know that water skiing was invented in Minnesota when 18-year-old Ralph Samuelson from Lake City on Lake Pepin strapped some wooden planks to his feet and went behind a boat and skied for the very first time. Well, at least that we know of in recorded history.
What year was that?
1922.
Okay.
So in that meantime, it had become very much more advanced, and you get things like trick skis. But so starting in 1964, there was a group called the TRA ski team, and they started performing shows at Darling Ranch. And it was every Sunday afternoon of the summer season. And they start the show by like the matching boats would go by, and these guys would run off the roof of the building that was right next to the lake, and they would do tricks. So the team consisted of Terry Aikenson and Tom Aikenson, who were brothers, Bryce Lundeen, who was a scuba instructor actually at the resort as well, so I had scuba diving as well, Steve Tesmer and Dennis Spalding, and then Linda Engstrom, who was a competitive skier, and she was the only female on the team. And fun fact, Tom and Linda actually end up getting married. Yes.
Oh, now it's a cute romance story.
Now it's a cute romance story. But, they would do pyramids, and they would do tricks, and one of them rode on a chair that was on water skis. And one of the coolest things is that they would one of them would be up on like a parasail, and then they'd like parasail land and onto the skis and go skiing.
This seems like a big thing that until, I'll be honest, last year when I got to see it at your guys' boat show and deal with some of those, you had reel-to-reel films of the old water shows. I wasn't even aware of this. I didn't realize there was so much acrobatic events.
Oh, they were so good. And I mean, compared to today where they have like dozens of people who are making up one show, it was just the 5 of them. But it was still really awesome to see, and they attracted tons of crowds.
And this is happening at Darling
Ranch.
Darling Ranch. We are out of the dude era.
We are out of the dude era. So it was definitely something that was fun and unique to see, and people like seeing it. But then...
Kind of sad I missed it.
I know. So the transition from Darling to Arrowwood. So in 1969, they started a $1.5 million expansion on the resort. So this expansion included 107 new hotel units, as well as an indoor swimming pool, sauna, dining room, cocktail lounge, convention space, club and meeting rooms, exercise rooms, snack rooms. So they were just full on diving into the resort aspect of it. But they didn't stick around for it, because in 1971 they sold it to the Radisson Hotel Corporation. And that turned it into a year-round operation called Arrowwood, which is where, funnily enough, our conference is being held.
Yes!
So Arrowwood was Darling Ranch. Now, none of the original buildings still stand, unfortunately. It's just that 1969 expansion. But, you can kind of just imagine, the old horse trail
and
along the front. And...
do have some slide pictures of it.
Yeah.
Quite a few.
Yeah, so actually in one of the photos we have, it's you can see the horses, and then there's the Navy raft out in the water.
Yes!
Yep. So, it's interesting that it's shifted to a year-round operation as well, because back before it was just a summertime operation, but there's been a push recently for Alexandria to become a year-round destination, so they offer things like snowmobile trails, and so
lots of interesting pieces in around Lake Darling, being named for a man who was killed by bushwhackers during the Civil War, going to, secret, illicit, drought, ditch digging, all the way up to Darling dudes becoming a Darling ranch for families, and a really nifty water show.
Yeah.
But thank you, Kaci. Kaci from the Legacy of the Lakes Museum. That is you.
That is me.
Thank you,
Brittany from the Douglas County Historical Society.
That is me. We'll round out this presentation, podcast, audio, recording, however you want to label it today. Thank you very much. Hope to catch you in the next one. And hopefully we'll be seeing or hearing from you soon in one way or another. Thank you.
Bye.